The battlefield was choked with smoke, dust, and the acrid sting of burning fuel. Wreckage from both sides lay twisted across the cracked earth, a graveyard of steel and bone. Corporal Elias Vey, a human mechanic turned reluctant soldier, stumbled through the debris with his armor scarred from the fighting. His squad had been scattered in the chaos, and silence pressed heavily on his ears, broken only by the distant groans of the dying. He was alone, or so he thought, until he heard a faint, desperate cry. Following the sound, Elias found her, a figure kneeling amidst the wreckage. Her skin was a brilliant azure marred with streaks of blood and ash, and her breaths came ragged and shallow. In her arms, swaddled in torn fabric, was a newborn. The mother's eyes, luminous and full of pain, flickered up to meet his. They weren't the eyes of an enemy, not in that moment. They were the eyes of someone clinging to her last shred of hope. Elias froze, torn between fear and awe, as the alien woman extended trembling hands toward him. Her lips moved, whispering words in a language he could barely recognize, but the plea was universal. She was asking him to take the child. Her strength was fading, and she had no one else to entrust her baby to. Elias's heart thundered in his chest, his training screaming at him to stay cautious, but the human in him overruled the soldier. Slowly he crouched, removing his gauntlet so his bare hand could touch the bundle she held. The infant was impossibly small, its skin a lighter shade of blue, its eyes sealed shut. The mother's tears streaked her cheeks as she placed the child into his arms. The gesture carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words, a bond forged in the ashes of war. Elias held the baby carefully, feeling the fragile rise and fall of its chest, the soft warmth radiating against the cold air. He had repaired machines his entire life, welded metal to metal, but this tiny life was something infinitely more delicate. For the first time since the war began, he felt a spark of meaning beyond survival. Her body quivered as she collapsed forward, barely managing to keep her gaze locked on his. She spoke again, slower this time, as if willing him to understand. He didn't know her words, but he understood her intent: protect, care, survive. Elias nodded, his throat too tight to speak, but his silent promise was etched into his soul. The mother's face softened with relief, even as her strength drained completely away. Her final breath slipped into the smoky air, leaving him with the child and the crushing weight of her trust. Elias's legs felt unsteady as he rose with the baby in his arms. Around him, the war zone stretched endlessly, soldiers from both factions either dead or fled. He had no squad to return to, no command center within reach. For the first time, he realized how utterly isolated he was. But when the infant stirred against his chest, making a faint, almost human-like whimper, he tightened his grip and knew his mission had changed. His orders were gone, but his purpose was clear. The sky above roared as ships passed, distant but still too close for comfort. Elias ducked behind shattered metal, shielding the child as best he could. His armor felt heavier now, not from damage but from responsibility. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to find shelter before another skirmish erupted. He studied the baby again, tiny fingers curling weakly against the fabric of the swaddle. The sight pierced through the numbness the war had carved into him. For the first time, his heart felt alive. He thought about the irony. Humans and this alien species had been slaughtering each other for years, yet here he was, holding one of their newborns as though it were his own blood. The child didn't know the difference. It only knew warmth, heartbeat, and safety. Elias swallowed hard, realizing that maybe, just maybe, the galaxy had been wrong all along. Enemies weren't born, they were made. And perhaps they could be unmade. The ground trembled suddenly as a nearby ship crashed, throwing waves of dirt and fire into the air. Elias shielded the baby, curling his body around it, teeth clenched as debris rained down. The infant cried out, a soft but piercing sound that cut through the chaos. He whispered soothing words, nonsense really, but the tone seemed to calm it. In that moment, Elias realized his survival wasn't just about him anymore. The life in his arms demanded more, and he would not fail it. Elias pressed onward, moving carefully between the wrecks. His mind raced with questions. How would he feed the child, protect it, explain it to his people if he ever returned? Would they see the child as he did, or just another enemy to be erased? He shook his head, focusing on the present. Those decisions would come later. For now, all that mattered was keeping the baby alive. The galaxy could wait. The child could not. The weight of the infant reminded him of his younger sister, back on Earth, whom he had carried on his shoulders through fields during summer evenings. Memories long buried rose again, mingling with the present. He thought of how innocent laughter had once filled his life, how family had felt before war consumed it. This child, alien or not, deserved that same chance at life. Elias clenched his jaw, a fire igniting within him. He would not let war dictate the fate of this fragile soul. As night approached, the battlefield fell eerily silent. Shadows stretched across the ruins and the air cooled. Elias found a small alcove beneath a half-collapsed transport and huddled inside, cradling the baby close. He wrapped his cloak around them both, feeling the child's warmth against his chest. The tiny breaths steadied him, and for the first time in years he felt more than just a soldier. He felt human again. His eyes caught the stars breaking through the smoke above. Distant, unreachable, yet watching. He thought of the dying mother's gaze, the trust she had placed in him. He thought of the galaxy, torn apart by hatred, and wondered if this child could be the beginning of something different. He whispered softly to the infant, promising protection, promising hope. The baby shifted, nestling closer as if it understood. Sleep teased at the edges of Elias's mind, but his grip never loosened. The weight of his decision pressed heavily on him, yet it didn't crush him. It anchored him. He realized that in saving this child, he had also saved himself from becoming another hollow shell of war. And though the galaxy was vast and hostile, one soldier and one infant against it, Elias believed in that moment that they had a chance. Far off, in the cold silence of the wreckage, eyes were watching. Not all lives on the battlefield had faded. Somewhere in the darkness, whispers stirred, carrying the news of a human who had taken an alien child, and with it, the first ripple of a story that would echo across the stars. The dawn crept slowly across the battlefield, casting a pale light over twisted metal and silent corpses. Elias stirred awake, stiff from sleeping on the cold ground, but the warmth against his chest reminded him of the purpose that now guided him. The infant, still wrapped in the tattered fabric, was breathing softly, its tiny chest rising and falling with fragile determination. He shifted carefully, whispering reassurances, though the baby was too young to understand. Somehow his own voice gave him strength to face the day. Hunger struck him first, a gnawing reminder of how little he had prepared for this new responsibility. He rummaged through the remnants of his supply pouch, finding only a few ration bars and a half-empty canteen. The child couldn't survive on those. He knew it would need more, something beyond his meager knowledge. He had repaired engines, welded hulls, but he had never cared for a life so small, so alien. Yet as he looked down at the child, he resolved he would learn, or die trying. He scanned the horizon for movement. Smoke rose in the distance and faint echoes of gunfire lingered, but the immediate area was quiet. Still, safety was an illusion. Patrols could sweep through at any time, human or alien, and either would see him as a traitor for cradling the infant of the enemy. He needed to move to find cover beyond the battlefield. He adjusted the straps on his armor, tightening them so the baby could rest securely against his chest as he walked. As he made his way through the wreckage, memories of his old life returned unbidden. Before the war, he had been a mechanic in the orbital shipyards, fixing freighters and patching smugglers' rusted haulers. He had dreamed once of traveling the stars, not fighting across them. Now, with this child in his care, that dream flickered again. Perhaps the galaxy held more than endless battles. Perhaps this baby was proof of that. It made him wonder if fate had placed him here for a reason. Hours passed, and Elias found himself at the edge of a ruined settlement. The structures were crumbling, half swallowed by fire and decay, but one building seemed intact enough to offer shelter. He slipped inside cautiously, pistol drawn, the baby shielded behind his arm. Dust filled the air and shadows stretched across the walls, but the silence was complete. He found a small room with a cot still standing. It wasn't much, but for now it was sanctuary. Setting the baby down gently, Elias checked the room for supplies. In a cabinet he found containers of liquid, some cracked and spoiled, others sealed tight. One bore markings he recognized, nutrient supplements often used by alien civilians. His heart quickened. Perhaps it was safe for the child. Testing it was risky, but leaving the child to starve was not an option. He soaked a rag with the liquid and let the baby suckle on it. The infant responded weakly at first, then latched, drinking with tiny, determined sips. Relief washed through him. For the first time, Elias allowed himself to breathe. He sat by the cot, watching the child feed, marveling at how something so small could hold such power over him. The child's survival meant more to him now than his own. It wasn't duty. It wasn't obligation. It was something deeper, an instinct he hadn't realized he carried. As he watched the baby close its eyes, drifting into sleep, he whispered, "You're safe now. I'll make sure of it." But safety was fragile. Later that night, faint footsteps echoed outside the settlement. Elias stiffened, pistol in hand, every muscle ready. He shielded the baby instinctively, heart pounding as shadows moved past the broken windows. He caught a glimpse of them, alien scavengers, their armor battered, their faces hard. Survivors of the same war, searching for resources. If they saw him with the child, their reaction was impossible to predict. To them, he might be both enemy and thief. He stayed silent, holding his breath as the scavengers passed. Their voices were harsh, their movements purposeful, but after what felt like an eternity, they moved on. Only then did Elias allow himself to breathe again, sweat dripping down his brow. The baby stirred in its sleep as if sensing his fear, and he calmed it with gentle touches. The encounter made one thing clear: he couldn't stay here long. Every moment in this war-torn world brought new dangers. The following morning, Elias packed what little he had and prepared to move again. He had no clear destination, only the conviction that somewhere beyond this wasteland there was a place where the child could live without fear, perhaps even thrive. The thought seemed impossible, yet it was the only hope he had. He strapped the baby securely and stepped into the light, his eyes set on the horizon, his heart set on survival. As they traveled, Elias began to talk to the child more. He told stories of Earth, of green fields and blue oceans, of laughter and music. He knew the baby couldn't understand, but speaking kept the shadows of despair away. In return, the child's tiny coos and whimpers filled the silence, reminding him that he wasn't alone. The bond between them deepened with each passing day, as if the universe itself had conspired to tie their fates together. One evening, beneath a fractured sky streaked with fading sunlight, Elias paused on a ridge. He held the baby up gently, letting it feel the breeze, and for a brief, fragile moment the world seemed at peace. The baby opened its eyes, deep, radiant pools of blue, and looked directly into his. The connection struck him like lightning. In those eyes he saw not just the child, but a future unbound by war. A future worth fighting for. But even as hope took root, the reality of their situation loomed. Supplies dwindled. Enemies lurked. And whispers of a human carrying an alien infant began to spread across the ruins like wildfire. Elias didn't know how the word had traveled, but he sensed the truth. They were being watched. Someone or something was already hunting them. Still, as he lay that night with the baby cradled against his chest, Elias refused to give in to despair. He had promised the mother he would protect her child, and he meant to keep that promise until his last breath. The galaxy might be vast and hostile, but within its endless dark he carried a spark of light, and he would guard that spark no matter the cost. The night was restless, filled with the distant rumble of artillery fire and the faint glow of burning wrecks on the horizon. Elias had managed only a few hours of shallow sleep, his body on constant alert. The infant shifted against his chest, stirring as if sensing his unease. He whispered softly, brushing a finger over its tiny hand, grounding himself in the fragile innocence he carried. War still raged beyond, but here in the quiet there was only the bond between protector and child. By morning he set off again, the ruined settlement now too dangerous to remain in. The rumors of his strange cargo gnawed at him, and every shadow felt like a pair of watching eyes. He traveled along ravines and through broken valleys, avoiding the open plains where patrols could spot him. His pace slowed, not just from exhaustion but from the constant need to keep the baby hidden, cradled close against his armor. Every step forward felt heavier, yet also more certain. There was no turning back now. As the sun rose high, Elias found himself on the edge of an abandoned outpost. Its walls were half collapsed, its towers burned out, but the underground bunkers might still hold supplies. He hesitated before entering, worried it could be occupied by desperate scavengers, but the baby's soft cries reminded him of the dwindling food. He had no choice. Moving cautiously, pistol raised, he descended into the darkness of the bunker. The air was thick with dust and mildew. His flashlight beam revealed rusted equipment and scattered crates. Most were empty, looted long ago, but in one corner he found sealed containers of alien medical supplies. He broke one open, discovering vials of nutrient fluid and a strange feeding apparatus. Relief flooded through him. It wasn't designed for human use, but it was clearly meant for infants. Carefully, he tested it, letting the baby drink. The child latched eagerly, and Elias exhaled, tension slipping from his shoulders. But he wasn't alone. As the infant fed, a voice echoed through the bunker in a language not his own. Elias froze, then turned slowly, gun raised. Two figures stepped from the shadows. Alien soldiers, battered and weary but very much alive. Their weapons aimed directly at him, their eyes narrowing as they took in the sight of a human cradling one of their young. The silence stretched, heavy with disbelief. Elias knew one wrong move would end both their lives. He lowered his weapon slowly, raising his free hand in surrender while keeping the baby shielded against him. The soldiers barked something sharp, their voices filled with suspicion. Elias shook his head, struggling to find the right words. He pointed to the child, then to his own chest, trying to convey that he was protecting it, not harming it. The soldiers exchanged glances, their stances wavering. Clearly, they hadn't expected this. One of them approached cautiously, weapon still raised. Elias held his ground, refusing to hand the baby over. He remembered the mother's eyes, the trust she had given him in her final moments. He would not betray that trust, not even if it meant dying here. His voice cracked as he spoke, words tumbling out. I promised her. I promised I'd keep this child safe. If you want me dead, fine. But the baby stays alive. The alien soldier hesitated, weapon lowering slightly as his eyes met Elias's. Something shifted in his expression. Confusion, maybe even recognition of the strange bond before him. The second soldier muttered sharply, urging caution, but the first finally lowered his weapon completely. He gestured for Elias to follow. Against his better judgment, Elias complied. He had no idea where they intended to take him, but he clung to one certainty. The baby was still breathing in his arms. They led him deeper into the bunker, through a hidden passage he hadn't noticed before. The walls opened into a chamber where a dozen more aliens sat huddled, survivors of the war. Their faces twisted with shock as they saw him, yet their eyes widened further at the infant in his arms. Whispered words rippled through the group, voices filled with awe and disbelief. The baby stirred, letting out a soft cry, and the tension in the room cracked like fragile glass. An older alien, clearly a leader, stepped forward. His gaze was stern, but when it fell on the child, it softened with unmistakable reverence. He spoke in slow, deliberate words, some of which Elias recognized. The infant was important, sacred even. Elias realized the mother he had encountered might not have been just any civilian. She had entrusted him with a child whose survival meant more than he understood. The leader approached, extending his hands toward the baby. Elias's grip tightened instinctively, his entire body coiled with resistance. The older alien paused, then nodded as though understanding his fear. Instead of forcing the issue, he placed a hand gently on Elias's shoulder, his touch not hostile but firm. He spoke again, words Elias could only half comprehend, but the meaning was clear. Protect the child together or lose everything. Elias's heart raced. Could he trust them? Could they trust him? The galaxy had been built on lines of division, yet here he stood, a human holding their future, and they didn't strike him down. He looked around the room at faces full of suspicion but also glimmers of hope. Slowly he relaxed his grip, not releasing the child but easing his posture. He wasn't their enemy. Not anymore. For the first time since the war began, Elias felt the weight of possibility. If this baby truly carried the hope of its people, then protecting it was bigger than any one soldier's promise. It could be the bridge between two worlds, yet he knew deep down that others on both sides would do anything to prevent that future. And so as the chamber fell silent around him, he realized their journey had only just begun. The chamber smelled of dust, old oil, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Elias sat cross-legged on the floor, the infant swaddled in his arms, while a dozen alien eyes studied him with a mix of suspicion and fragile hope. The leader who had touched his shoulder earlier remained standing in front of him, silent as if weighing the very soul of the human before him. Elias's chest tightened under the scrutiny, but when the child whimpered softly, he leaned close and soothed it, his voice low and tender. The act seemed to ripple through the survivors, as though they were watching something sacred unfold in the ruins of war. Hours passed in tense quiet before the older alien finally spoke again, His words slow, deliberate, chosen for their weight. Elias understood only fragments, but enough to piece together the meaning. The baby was not ordinary. It was the last surviving child of a noble line, perhaps even royalty, whose bloodline carried cultural and spiritual significance for these people. To them, this infant was more than a child. It was a symbol of survival, a beacon for their fractured species. Elias's stomach churned as he realized the gravity of the responsibility he carried. The revelation spread through the survivors like a storm. Some argued heatedly, their voices rising in sharp tones, gesturing angrily at Elias. Others looked on him with a strange reverence, as though the mother's decision to hand her baby to a human was an omen, a divine act of fate. Elias listened without understanding the words, but he could read their emotions clearly. He was at the heart of something larger than himself, a fragile thread pulling together the remains of two broken peoples. When night fell, the survivors lit makeshift lamps, their faint glow casting long shadows on the bunker walls. Elias sat with the baby nestled against his chest, watching the aliens form a circle as they debated in hushed tones. He wanted to speak, to assure them he was no threat, but language was a barrier that made every word feel like stone in his mouth. Instead, he relied on action, gently rocking the child, feeding it with the salvaged apparatus and whispering stories of Earth. He didn't know if they understood his words, but they seemed to understand his intent. Sleep came fitfully, and when Elias woke, it was to the sound of a soft chant. The aliens were gathered around, their voices weaving together in a haunting, melodic rhythm. They were singing not to him but to the child. He watched, transfixed as they bowed their heads, hands pressed over their hearts, their voices vibrating with a mournful beauty. Elias held the baby up slightly, letting it hear, and for a moment he swore he saw the infant stir as if comforted by the song. It was then that Elias began to understand. He was no longer just protecting a child. He was protecting a legacy. The war had stripped the galaxy of compassion, but in this tiny life and in the fragile trust of those around him, there was still something unbroken. He swore silently to the mother he had left on the battlefield. Her sacrifice would not be wasted. The child would live. The child would thrive, and Elias would fight the galaxy itself to ensure it. The following day brought danger. A scouting party, armed, human, and hostile, swept through the outskirts of the settlement. The bunker shook with the thunder of boots above. The survivors froze, panic crackling through the chamber like lightning. Elias's blood ran cold. If his own kind found him here, holding an alien infant among survivors, he would be branded a traitor, executed without hesitation. He cradled the baby tightly, heart hammering, praying the soldiers would pass without discovering the hidden passage. But fate was merciless. A clatter echoed down the corridor, followed by the harsh beam of a flashlight. Elias's instincts roared to life. He pressed the infant into the arms of the older alien leader, meeting his gaze with fierce intensity. "Protect them," Elias whispered, even though he knew the words might not be understood. Then he rose, pistol in hand, and moved toward the entrance. If the soldiers wanted blood, they would take his before they ever reached the child. The firefight was brutal and short. Gunfire rattled through the corridor, sparks showering as rounds slammed into steel. Elias fired back with precision born of desperation, cutting down the first two soldiers who entered. But more poured in, their voices barking orders, their weapons tearing the air with heat and fury. Pain lanced through his side as a shot grazed him, but he stood firm, a wall of defiance holding the line. Behind him he heard the faint cries of the infant, the sound that gave him the strength to endure. The aliens surged to his side. Despite their exhaustion, they fought with feral determination, blades and scavenged rifles clashing with human steel. For a fleeting moment, enemies who had slaughtered each other only days before stood shoulder to shoulder. Elias and the survivors carved a desperate defense, forcing the human squad to falter. The bunker rang with screams, the air thick with smoke and fire, but at last the attackers fell silent. The survivors stood bloody, panting, alive. Elias leaned heavily against the wall, his pistol smoking, his breath ragged. When he turned, the leader stood with the baby safe in his arms. Relief swept through Elias so fierce that he almost collapsed. The older alien stepped forward, pressing the child gently back into his grasp, as if acknowledging his right to carry it. Their eyes locked, and in that unspoken moment a bond was sealed. They were no longer enemies. They were guardians of the same fragile hope. In the days that followed, whispers spread beyond the bunker. Survivors spoke of the human who carried the child of their people, who fought beside them when death closed in. The story traveled faster than Elias could imagine, carried on the lips of scavengers, deserters, and smugglers. Soon both humans and aliens would hear of it, a tale too strange to ignore, too dangerous to suppress. Elias knew the war councils on both sides would see the child not as hope, but as a threat to their power. Yet in the quiet moments when the baby rested against him, Elias allowed himself to dream. He imagined a galaxy where the child could grow without fear, where humans and aliens might sit together not as soldiers but as families. He spoke to the infant of green fields and blue oceans, of laughter and the simple joy of peace. He didn't know if such a world could exist, but he believed it was worth chasing. Tension grew within the survivor group. Some wanted to move deeper into hiding. Others argued they should reveal the child to their people to rally hope. Elias listened, torn, knowing that any choice carried risk. But one thing was clear: the galaxy was no longer blind to them. Danger would come again, and soon. He began to prepare, scavenging weapons, patching armor, and teaching himself the alien tongue piece by piece. Every skill, every breath was for the child. One evening, the leader sat with Elias by the fire, both of them silent, the infant nestled between them. For the first time, the alien spoke in halting, broken words of human speech. "You, protect, together." Elias's throat tightened as he nodded, his chest swelling with something between pride and sorrow. They were two men of different worlds, but united by a single vow. The galaxy would hunt them, but it would not break them. The infant grew stronger with each passing day, its cries louder, its grip firmer. Elias felt the weight of its tiny hand clutching his finger, and knew that he had become something more than a soldier. He had become a father, not by blood, but by choice. And that choice bound him to a destiny larger than war. As the stars wheeled overhead, Elias looked up and whispered a silent prayer, not to any god he knew, but to the mother who had trusted him. He promised her once more that her child would live, that her sacrifice would echo not in death but in the survival of her bloodline. The galaxy might never forgive him, but perhaps one day it would understand. And so the story of the human and the alien child began to spread, a seed of legend planted in the ashes of war. Some would call it betrayal, others would call it hope. But for Elias, it was neither. It was simply a promise kept and a life worth fighting for until the very end.